What if the nearest cell tower wasn't anchored to the ground at all? What if it was orbiting 500 kilometers straight up, just moving at 17,000 miles per hour?
I mean, it forces a complete recalculation of global telecommunications. We are shifting from an era constrained by terrestrial geography and, physical cable laying, straight into an era where your infrastructure is deployed in low Earth orbit.
And that structural shift is the mission for this deep dive. We are tearing through a massive stack of incredibly fresh sources today. We've got Q4 2025 earnings transcripts, SEC filings, some really sharp analyst research from William Blair and Crossroads Capital.
And those new environmental impact studies, which are crucial.
Exactly, because we are evaluating a massive, highly contrarian investment thesis today. The core question is this. Is a relatively unknown Texas company called AST Spacemobile actually better positioned to capture the global space-based cellular market than the two absolute behemoths in the room, meaning SpaceX and Amazon?
To accurately price the market dynamics here, you have to look at the sheer scale of the capital involved. I mean, we're talking about the foundation of a new global data layer. Look at SpaceX. They are actively pushing for a $1.75 trillion IPO in 2026.
Right.
But if you strip away the rocket hype, if you look at the actual financials, that valuation rests almost entirely on Starlink's orbital broadband monopoly.
Yeah, Starlink is the engine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And on the other side, you have Amazon pouring over $10 billion into their recently rebranded Amazon Leo project. Wall Street currently views this as a binary race between two titans. But the underlying data, specifically the architectural differences in their technology, well, it suggests that the market consensus is fundamentally flawed.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because anyone betting against Starlink right now is betting against an absolute juggernaut. I mean, according to traditional metrics, they are dominating. In 2025, Starlink hit $11.4 billion in revenue.
With a 63% EBITDA margin.
Which is insane. For anyone listening, that margin is critical because space infrastructure is all upfront capital, right? Once those satellites are deployed, the cost to add a new subscriber is essentially zero. And they doubled their user base to 10 million people in a single year.
And we can't ignore the internal burn rate at SpaceX. Starlink is their sole profitable segment right now. Their AI venture, XAI, is just burning through $9.5 billion in cash.
Right, so Starlink isn't just a side project. It is the financial engine keeping that whole $1.75 trillion IPO dream alive.
Absolutely. And Amazon's acceleration is equally aggressive, but it's driven by regulatory pressure. They currently have 200 satellites in orbit, but they are staring down an unyielding Federal Communications Commission deadline.
The July 2026 one?
Right. The FCC requires Amazon to deploy half of its 3,236 satellite constellation by July 2026, or they risk losing their spectrum authorization entirely.
Wow.
Yeah, that timeline is forcing Amazon to spend massive amounts of capital on launch vehicles at premium prices. And Amazon CEO Andy Jassy is not building this just to connect rural homes. He is pitching deep, seamless integration with AWS for enterprise and government clients. They are actively trying to bypass the terrestrial internet entirely, routing data from space directly into their proprietary cloud analytics engines.
So if I'm an investor looking at this landscape, it feels like Starlink is cementing itself as like the modern landline monopoly of space.
Yeah.
If SpaceX already has thousands of satellites in orbit and Amazon has the infinite cash flow of AWS to fund their deployment, it really seems like the barrier to entry is insurmountable. How does a company from Midland, Texas, with a fraction of the deployed satellites even enter the conversation, let alone compete?
What's fascinating here is that the market is mispricing the space because they are conflating two entirely different technological use cases.
Right.
Starlink has built the perfect infrastructure for fixed home broadband. You mount a specialized dish on your roof, it mechanically tracks a satellite, and boom, you receive high-speed internet.
Yeah.
But SpaceX is attempting to take that exact same architectural model and force it into the mobile direct-to-device market. They're trying to connect their satellites directly to the unmodified smartphone sitting in your pocket right now.
And that's where the thesis falls apart.
Exactly. The analyst note from Crossroads Capital framed it perfectly. Starlink built the greatest hockey stick in the world, but now they are trying to use that hockey stick to play a round of golf on the PGA Tour. It is fundamentally the wrong tool for the job.
Let's break down the mechanics of why it's the wrong tool, because it really just comes down to basic physics. Starlink's architecture is totally mismatched for tiny, unmodified smartphone antennas. The antenna in your phone is designed to talk to a cell tower a few miles away, right? Not a satellite in the exosphere.
Right. So this creates a structural opening for a company built strictly for mobile. AST Spacemobile's approach relies on sheer size. Starlink's current V2 satellites have a surface area of about 65 square feet. AST's new Block 2 Bluebird satellites are 2,400 square feet.
It's massive.
We are talking about a satellite the exact size of a professional basketball court.
And size dictates power generation. In space, power is the absolute limiting factor for data throughput. These massive Bluebirds are generating 100 to 120 kilowatts of power per satellite.
Which is wild.
Because the antenna inside an unmodified mobile phone is way too weak to transmit a heavy data load 500 kilometers into space, the satellite has to do all the heavy lifting. AST uses these massive phased array antennas, so instead of just broadcasting a wide signal, a phased array uses hundreds of tiny antenna elements that slightly delay their signals.
Like creating an interference pattern. Exactly. It creates an interference pattern that focuses the radio frequency into a highly concentrated, high-power beam directed straight at a single user's phone. Starlink's smaller satellites physically cannot generate the power required to match that throughput. When Starlink tries to push a mobile signal, it spills sideways.
Which immediately triggers regulatory interference limit. They get capped by the FCC.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The size difference is crucial. But their data handling architecture is what fundamentally changes the business model. AST utilizes what's called a bent pipe architecture.
This is the real moat.
Yeah. Starlink acts as a space-based router, right? It actively processes the data on board the satellite. AST satellites are entirely passive. They are literal cell towers suspended in space. They catch the signal from your phone and immediately reflect it back down to a terrestrial gateway. The actual processing, routing, and switching of the data happens on the ground.
Managed directly by the mobile network operators, the carriers.
Exactly, like AT&T, Verizon, Vodafone.
And that passive architecture is AST's most potent strategic advantage. By not processing the data, AST ensures that the terrestrial carriers retain total control over the customer relationship, the billing, the data security.
Right.
Think about it. If AT&T partners with Starlink, Starlink processes the data and AT&T effectively just becomes a dumb pipe. By partnering with AST, the carriers maintain their dominance.
Plus, it makes AST's satellites forward compatible. When the telecom industry inevitably upgrades to 6G, AST does not need to launch a whole new fleet of satellites. The carriers just upgrade the routing software at their ground stations.
Yep, but the ultimate moat, the real reason the carriers are locking in is spectrum. Starlink uses high-frequency satellite bands, which suffer from massive signal degradation when trying to penetrate a building or a dense forest canopy.
Yeah, good luck getting a signal indoors.
Right. AST operates as a wholesale partner, utilizing the carrier's existing low-band cellular spectrum. It is the exact same low-frequency spectrum your phone is already programmed to use.
So instead of forcing the consumer's device to learn a totally new language to speak with the satellite, AST forces the satellite to speak standard cellular protocol.
Right.
But I have to challenge the physical reality of this plan, okay? From an engineering perspective, building a phased array the size of a basketball court is impressive on the ground. Cramming it into a payload fairing, subjecting it to the extreme vibrational forces of a rocket launch, and then expecting it to unfold in a zero-gravity vacuum without tearing itself apart.
It's an engineering nightmare.
Right. Doesn't the sheer complexity of that deployment severely threaten the viability of the company? Furthermore, at an altitude of 500 kilometers, low Earth orbit still has trace atmospheric particles. A 2,400 square foot flat surface is going to act like a giant sail catching micro-resistance. How do they not just succumb to atmospheric drag and fall back to Earth?
Well, the drag issue is precisely why these satellites require substantial onboard propulsion systems to maintain their orbital altitude, which, adds weight and complexity. As for the deployment, it is an engineering gauntlet, but it's protected by over 3,100 patents and patent-pending claims.
Wow, 3,100.
Yeah. AST figured out how to package a massive, dense plane of electronics into a narrow cylinder and unfurl it with millimeter precision. Here's the contrarian insight. If SpaceX realized their mobile architecture was flawed today and decided to copy AST, they couldn't just reverse engineer it.
Does the patent wall?
Right. They would need a completely new bill of materials, a total redesign of their satellite bus, and years of physical testing just to avoid infringing on AST's intellectual property.
Okay, so solving the physics problem of unfolding a giant solar sail is one thing. Financing the construction of an entire constellation of them is another. Let's look at AST's current financial reality, because their Q4 2025 earnings show they have officially transitioned from a speculative concept into a commercial stage company.
The numbers were solid.
They really were. They reported $70.9 million in full-year revenue, absolutely surpassing analyst estimates of $35 million. They are sitting on $3.9 billion in liquidity and a $1.2 billion contracted backlog. And recently, their stocks surged 50% after they secured a $65 million commercial prepayment deal with Verizon.
That Verizon prepayment is highly revealing. Look, carriers do not hand over $65 million in upfront cash to unproven space technology unless they are deploying defensive capital.
Exactly.
Verizon sees T-Mobile attempting to partner with Starlink, and they know they cannot afford to be left behind if space-based cellular becomes the new industry standard. From a balance sheet perspective, AST has successfully de-risked its capital structure. They have enough liquidity to fund the manufacturing of their initial constellation without issuing dilutive convertible debt.
The capital markets have bought into the thesis.
They have, but gravity remains completely indifferent.
Yeah, that brings us to the operational reality highlighted in the sources from just yesterday, April 19, 2026. AST's Bluebird 7 satellite was launched aboard Blue Origin's New Glenn rocket. The satellite separated, powered on, but Blue Origin's upper stage inserted it into an orbit that was severely too low.
A critical error.
Right, and because these massive satellites use their onboard propulsion mostly to counteract that atmospheric drag we discussed, Bluebird 7 does not have the thrust capacity to correct such a massive orbital deficit.
It's stuck.
It has to be deorbited and allowed to burn up, is a total loss of the hardware. AST stated they need 45 to 60 satellites in orbit by the end of 2026 for continuous coverage. Does losing Bluebird 7 shatter their timeline and their entire investment thesis?
It is a harsh setback, no doubt. But the analyst notes from CCS Insight and Recon Analytics frame it as a manageable operational hazard. The satellite hardware didn't fail, the delivery vehicle failed, and the financial impact is mitigated because the satellite is fully insured, meaning the capital cost will be recovered.
So it's a delay, not a death blow.
Yeah, right. But here's what this failure actually exposes. This is the critical bottleneck of the entire space economy. The constraint is no longer satellite manufacturing. AST's facilities in Texas and Florida are currently churning out 6 of these massive satellites every month. The real systemic risk to AST's entire business model is launch capacity.
Their destiny is entirely tethered to the availability of rockets. And the irony here is just incredible. AST is relying on SpaceX's Falcon 9 and Blue Origin's New Glenn to lift their constellation. They are literally paying their direct competitors.
The parent companies of Starlink and Amazon Leo.
Yes, paying them to ferry their disruptive technology into orbit. If SpaceX decides to prioritize their own Starlink launches, or if Blue Origin suffers more launch delays like they did with Bluebird 7, AST's deployment schedule is completely at their mercy.
The execution of AST's strategy is fundamentally constrained by the operational cadence of its biggest rivals. And when you look at the scale of these deployments, launching dozens of basketball court-sized satellites, we have to widen our analytical lens here. We must evaluate the macro risk facing AST, Starlink, and Amazon Leo alike, which is the physical carrying capacity of low Earth orbit itself.
And the environmental studies provided in our sources present a highly sobering reality about that capacity. We are looking directly at the mechanics of the Kessler effect. SpaceX is planning an eventual constellation of 42,000 satellites.
42,000. It's staggering.
And China is rushing to deploy a rival network of 40,000 satellites. Low Earth orbit is becoming a highly congested highway. The Kessler effect theorizes that a single catastrophic collision between two objects creates a cloud of high-velocity fragments.
Shrapnel, basically.
Right. And because these fragments are moving at orbital speeds, they strike other satellites, creating an exponential chain reaction of debris until low Earth orbit becomes a self-pulverizing, unusable junkyard.
And the mathematics of orbital debris are dictated by mass and cross-sectional area. The number of fragments generated by an impact is directly proportional to the mass of the satellite.
Which is bad news for AST.
Exactly. An AST Bluebird is massive. If it is struck, it will generate a significantly larger debris field than a smaller Starlink satellite. However, the risk equation changes entirely when you look at the statistical encounter rate.
What do you mean?
Well, AST only requires approximately 90 satellites to achieve continuous global cellular coverage. SpaceX requires tens of thousands. So while AST satellites present larger individual targets, having only 90 targets traversing orbit drastically lowers the overall probability of a collision compared to managing 40,000 targets actively dodging each other.
That makes sense. But the threat of collision is only half the environmental equation. We have to look at the mechanism of what happens when these satellites reach the end of their operational life. The standard industry practice is atmospheric demise. They intentionally deorbit the satellite, just as they're doing right now with the failed Bluebird 7, allowing it to burn up in the atmosphere so it doesn't crash into a populated area.
Right.
But these satellites are constructed primarily of aluminum. The environmental impact studies detail that when they disintegrate, they inject massive amounts of fine particulate aluminum directly into the stratosphere. This particulate matter alters Earth's albedo, which is the measure of how much solar radiation the Earth reflects, and acts as a catalyst that strips away the ozone layer.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it functions as an unintended, completely uncontrolled geoengineering experiment. The telecom industry is injecting metals into the upper atmosphere at a volume that exponentially exceeds the natural deposition of meteoric dust.
And because AST's satellites are so large,
Their aluminum mass fraction per unit is incredibly high. The long-term atmospheric chemistry changes are not currently priced into any of these companies' valuations.
now, if you are listening to this, you might be wondering why these companies don't just push the satellites further out into space when they die, rather than burning them up in the atmosphere. Why not just park them out of the way?
The alternative is moving them into a graveyard orbit, which sits roughly 2,000 kilometers above Earth. But the physics of orbital mechanics makes that solution highly prohibitive. Pushing a massive object from a 500-kilometer operational orbit up to a 2,000-kilometer graveyard orbit requires reserving up to 5% of the satellite's total mass for fuel.
That's a massive payload penalty.
It is. That is fuel that generates zero revenue. It's just dead weight that occupies precious payload capacity during the initial launch.
And even if a company accepts the economic penalty of carrying that deadweight fuel, graveyard orbits introduce an entirely different environmental consequence. When you park highly reflective, 2,400 square foot mirrors in a higher orbit, they continue to catch the sun's rays long after the sun has set on the surface of the Earth.
Yeah, the light pollution from thousands of decommissioned satellites occupying graveyard orbits would severely contaminate the night sky. The light reflects back down, leaving these bright streaks across the lenses of ground-based observatories. It fundamentally disrupts optical astronomy. There is no simple zero-impact solution here. The environmental toll, whether it's orbital debris, stratospheric aluminum, or light pollution, is the hidden tax on this entire space-based internet revolution.
It's a precarious balance between technological progress and orbital sustainability. Well, we have unpacked the engineering architecture, the capital flows, and the environmental limitations. Let's distill the thesis. In the race to commercialize orbital broadband, Starlink has effectively conquered the fixed-home internet market, and their $1.75 trillion valuation heavily reflects that dominance.
No question.
However, AST Spacemobile's massive spectrum-sharing bent pipe architecture gives them a structural advantage in the mobile direct-to-device market. By acting as a seamless, passive extension of existing terrestrial cellular networks, they have built a moat that Starlink cannot easily bridge with their current hardware.
And that architectural difference represents the core mispricing in the market today. Investors are operating under the assumption that the victor in fixed broadband will automatically capture mobile. AST's technology demonstrates that the mobile market requires an entirely different approach.
A completely different tool.
Right. The investment case for AST is robust, but it is contingent on two external factors.
Oh.
They must maintain their deployment cadence without their competitors choking off their launch supply.
Which is a real risk.
And the industry as a whole must avoid turning low Earth orbit into an unusable debris field before the networks are fully operational.
Which leaves us with a final provocative reality to consider. Right now, this feels like a commercial space race, a battle between billionaire founders and disruptive startups. But as legacy terrestrial telecommunications companies like AT&T and Verizon become fundamentally dependent on AST's space-based infrastructure to route everyday cellular traffic, the stakes are going to shift.
Absolutely.
We are approaching a point where global governments may step in and classify these commercial satellite constellations as critical national security infrastructure. And if that happens, if we transition from an era of unregulated commercial enterprise into an era of strict federal oversight and nationalization protocols, what happens to the massive valuations of SpaceX and AST Spacemobile? The true value of the space economy won't be captured solely by the company with the most satellites, but by the company whose technology becomes indispensable to the devices we already rely on every single day.
If you remember one thing, it's this. AST isn't trying to replace the telecom giants. They are making themselves the irreplaceable orbital linchpin that those giants depend on to survive the next decade of mobile connectivity.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking up.